Admiral Studeman, you described, China's willingness to employ a number of tactics, both maybe current and sort of being prepared for foreseen tactics to harvest technology. We have this U.S. underwater ecosystem, innovation ecosystem. And you described it, I think, in response to Commissioner Kuiken's last question about guarding tech development. I guess my question is, how would you prioritize where we're most exposed in that ecosystem? And then two, if you can kind of draw that to some of your recommendations, policy recommendations as to, what Congress or administration should prioritize.
Well, I think we're most exposed with the level of awareness of the American people as to the nature of what we're talking about in general with regard to the strategic competition and what it means for America's future and whether or not we should be hardening ourselves because it will require more hard choices for our research labs, our academic institutions, think tanks, government folks, non-government personnel. So we just haven't had a conversation with the country. We're distracted. We're not told that this is sort of the top, priority of the 21st century to deal with this level of a nation-state challenge. And it's really not just one nation-state. It's multiple red nations that, aim to see the U.S. decline. So I wish we would get to this conversation as a nation, and I wish we would actually have a comprehensive campaign by which we would harden ourselves and our allies and partners to be able to understand, what's at stake. And so I think that's probably the most important aspect of this, to say that technologically speaking, they inhabit our system and we don't inhabit theirs, right? And they're very good at theft as well as legitimate purchases and acquisition of knowledge. And this ultimately creates the capability, I think, that you want to talk about. So if you can't do that first part, you're not going to be able to actually protect yourself in the end game, right, of things that are actually manifest, that they're, actual capabilities that the Chinese can use against us. I do think we have enough lead time to consider what it means for us in terms of homeland defense and not just about something that's way over there. The American homeland, by the way, starts in the U.S. territory of Guam. That's where America's day begins. So we have to think of that as the homeland, mid-pack. We have commitments that we make to some Pacific islands, right? They're the compact states. And so we need to think in those terms of what does it take to actually protect those places. And long lead times may allow us to, afford to do different things. I've recommended that not only do we look at modernizing our SOSA systems, our sound surveillance systems, as those are fixed systems, but you need to have the whole mobile network that may be established along the right places and the right vital areas for the homeland. We need to do things like baselining our port areas so that we understand the acoustic environment, because you're going to find an adversary thing somewhere in there, and you want to be able to identify it and then react to it properly and not be confused as to what that is before it's too late. And we have nuclear facilities and other things that are accessible by water. And so we need to make sure that we're protected there. So those are the kinds of things that I worry about.
Dr. Horowitz, any reaction to that or anything that you would add, particularly the point about our institutions needing to harden themselves a bit, as Admiral Studeman described?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that China has demonstrated for decades its willingness and ability to exploit the openness of our society to gain access to all sorts of knowledge relevant for military capabilities and assisting them economically. Our openness is a strength, and so this is our great strength. This is why America is the greatest engine of innovation the world has ever seen. But we face constraints in that regard, especially I think in the basic research kind of arena where it's hard to, Admiral Studeman was pointing to some of the security challenges we can sometimes face. It's hard to close things off or even advocate for closing things off in some cases, because the impact might be to undermine the ability of some of our great institutions to pursue many of the innovations that they have been pursuing. And so there's a there's a balance here, and it's been really challenging for the United States to, I think, recognize some of these security threats and act against them. But there's clearly more we need to do in that arena.
Agreed. Okay. Thank you.
China leveraging its merchant ship fleet, its fishing vessels, some of its other what we would describe as civilian capabilities, and the risks that are potentially associated with that. Could you unpack what those risks might look like in practical terms for us to better understand?
Well, you've already seen a taste of sort of Chinese black operations, probably done in concert with Russia, with some of the merchant ships dragging their anchors through the Baltic and destroying cables and energy, lines there. And so I would expect that sort of the Russian tactics and techniques on this are probably being shared with the Chinese as they deepen their relationship. And so many people are obsessed on the so-called gray zone. You need to be equally conscious of the black zone. In other words, there's ambiguous behavior, and then there's things that are designed not to leave any fingerprints, or did the event even happen, right? And that's where the Chinese, think a lot about what their, options and capabilities should be. If you think about a Costco ship that comes through, look, we know that there are sort of party committees, that they have probably intel collection capability on some or many of those, that they are traversing our port system all over the place. And so when we think about, a contingency, we would need to think about how we would forestall access by those kinds of vessels that could have, look, you can put anything in a container, right? You can drop anything over the side, or, you can create all sorts of cavities inside merchant ships to do things that on the surface don't look like they're doing anything, but underwater there's some significant action taking place. And so whether it's divers, whether it's mines, whether it's sensors, whether it's torpedoes or what have you, we need to be thinking unconventionally about these things and without a geographic constraint, because our adversary thinks along these lines.
Thank you. Dr. Horowitz, anything you'd like to add to that?
I agree with that completely. I think that the subseabed threat in particular from China has not gotten as much play as the subseabed threat from Russia. But Ben Schmidt, who's another researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, has done some extensive work on the subseabed topic that I'd certainly recommend to any of the commissioners. And I think that this challenge is enormous and illustrates, exactly that gray-black distinction that Admiral Studeman suggested.
Right, thank you. Admiral Studeman, I really appreciate your raising maritime strength versus naval strength and the risks associated with, frankly, the United States allowing our maritime strength to atrophy over the last several decades, and that obviously takes time to build back. Are there specific areas that you would recommend of particular focus in the maritime space as we continue to build out our naval power as well?
Yeah, I do think, if you take a look at the Chinese commercial fleet, 12,000 plus, vessels, and we have a few hundred U.S. flagged. I mean, you're not going to catch up with that probably ever, right? But I do think we need to expand our merchant marine cadre, right, and the number of U.S. built or cooperatively built, ships that we can have guaranteed, access to provide a variety of different functions that relate to, our economy over time, regardless of sort of the contingency. And so I think we do need to, strengthen those endemic capabilities that should be part of a great nation. And I do think that, the president, the executive orders that have been issued about how to rebuild the maritime industry, those things should be campaigned on, intensified, followed through with thoroughly, because everything that was outlined in that, initial executive order needs to be part of our future there. And I hope we robustly pursue it under this administration and regardless of whatever administration may follow, to continue to keep the knots up in producing, what's described, because I do think that that was a very accurate assessment, a diagnosis of where we are, and we have too many infirmities and where we need to be.
Thank you.
I want to further pull on this string of what I keep thinking of is perhaps we have a lack of imagination on where we should be concerned. So, Admiral Studeman, you have one particular paragraph where you talked about how China has also masterminded the ability to legitimately buy and illicitly steal technology. I'm trying to get my head around what you've alluded to and the need to harden our institutions. Do you have examples that you can share, or a particular example where this stands out?
So when I was wearing a uniform, I was once asked about something similar, and I talked with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service to find out exactly how many cases of what kinds of naval technology the Chinese have been licitly or illicitly been after. And it turns out that I had to go onto the second page, and I was not done with the amount of aggressive Chinese collection by any means possible to go after naval technology. That's just one warfare area, right? This is spread across all of, our different sectors, whether it's aerospace, all the way through land warfare, cyber, electromagnetic, et cetera. Look, this is a massive sort of millions and millions of grains of sand, collection by hook or by crook that targets almost every pertinent technology that exists if it's relevant for building one's economy, developing one's own technological power, or if it's building military power outright. So this is the way of the Chinese. And so if you're looking at specific technologies, it's better to ask what technology has not been, pursued, because you may get a few items.
And is it from relationships with research institutions, from manufacturers, from the corporate world, or all of the above?
All of the above.
So this failure of sort of imagination on our part while trying to balance it with our open society, how do you walk that line?
Yeah, I do think that, first of all, our counterintelligence capability is too small. I think that we've probably pulled off some counterintelligence folks to do other missions too that should have been kept on this particular target. So whether you're talking about China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, others, I mean, there's a variety of different counterintelligence capacity shortfalls that we've had. But look, counterintelligence typically goes after foreign intelligence entities, right? And the Chinese approach is not to just use essentially trained spies to do espionage. That's a small fraction of actually what they do. So we need to actually enlist the commercial industries to understand what vigilance actually looks like when the approach is to use any association, right? Any connection, whether it's from the outside, whether it's a company that's just trying to buy in stakes, a Chinese company that may buy stakes in a U.S. company just to get the IP, right? The intellectual property. Or you don't know that there's a Chinese entity somewhere in this system down multiple levels of the supply chain. So we need supply chain transparency, right? Which takes a lot of collection and analysis because it's ever moving depending on where we are. So securitizing our economy can't be just a government function. It will require us to make the case to American companies, no matter their size, and to help incentivize what they do to protect themselves. So this is a security issue, not just a counterintelligence issue, but that's the way to start, maybe putting a lens on this to understand exactly that civ mil fusion on the Chinese side means it doesn't matter how they get it, it ends up being fused back on the Chinese side for capabilities that then they scale much faster than we can.
Particularly related to ports, are we paying enough attention? This commission has talked about it a lot over the last few years, but would you comment on that?
Yeah, I commented on baselining some non-traditional things like what is the acoustic environment and how do you sample that over time to make sure you have a good baseline so you can detect anomalies? How do you make sure that we can actually do three-dimensional support of, vital areas? The Coast Guard and Homeland Security, FBI, and others have been very attuned to buying Chinese cranes, let's say, other capabilities that have an ability to phone home. And I think we have some initiatives underway to make sure that we're not dependent on Chinese technology that they use in commercial ports. But many states, still have that tech there. It'll take them years to back out of commitments they made for cheap, Chinese port technology. So there are multiple ways this shows up. I do believe we have some visibility on those, and I hope we're pursuing in a campaign way a way to de-risk.
Thank you.
One topic that we spent very little time talking about so far has been torpedoes. I understand that the Chinese are working on a new heavyweight torpedo. There have been advances in supercavitation for years. Question for both of you, how much time do you spend worrying about Chinese torpedo advances?
Well, it was my life for many years, so it hasn't slipped from my mind. And I mentioned that with regard to the transoceanic torpedo, so that you can look lightweight torpedoes in numbers and placed in the right areas can be devastating as well. And so you don't disregard any of that. But we do need to be mindful, and this goes back to the China-Russia connection, whether or not the Russians would make the Chinese privy to everything that they've learned about their Status 6 or Poseidon torpedo, which is a nuclear powered, nuclear armed torpedo that can go across entire oceans at depth, let's say about 3,000 feet at high speed, 100 plus miles an hour. What is the challenge of detecting it and dealing with something of that nature? Whether it's conventional or nuclear, that's not just a STRATCOM question, right? This is a question we need to take a look at, and we need to have a fine-tuned understanding of exactly, therefore, the Russians may be sharing with the Chinese in this kind of strategic weaponry, right? And so we have to look at the entire family, but I do worry about some more than others.
The Chinese, if you look at, it's not just the torpedo technology in this context. Something like the YJ-19, which is a hypersonic designed to be launched from Chinese torpedo tubes, I think is another example of a kind of technology they're working on in this context. And they're also looking at, in the same way that the United States is looking at this in some context, edge compute and what they can do with edge compute in some of their new heavyweight torpedoes to make them smarter and more accurate, especially at longer ranges. And I would just double tap what Admiral Studeman said about the Poseidon, which is an incredibly dangerous way of piece of military technology. At the end of the day, at least I'm not familiar with any evidence China has said they would replicate it in the short term, but it certainly seems plausible that they might think about that over time. Particularly to, again, put more pressure on the U.S. and the undersea.
If I could just follow up, there's a little bit of hint based on papers that have been written about the Chinese talking about this, and so that's the source of my concern.
We've spent some time reviewing the personnel pipeline for Chinese submariners, including the process for recruiting to the PLAN Submarine Academy. The numbers I've seen have been, I think, shockingly low in terms of the recruitment numbers, but how would you say that the Chinese recruitment pipeline for submariners compares to the U.S. side, both quantitatively and qualitatively?
Well, I think the average U.S. submariner, given what they need to pass in terms of tests, they are probably the smartest folks that we allow in any community right there. So I don't think that the average Chinese submariner would ever compare to the average American submariner. The Chinese have, a lower base, I guess, from which to work, and that's a testament to some of our academic institutions and the quality people that we produce. But the Chinese have identified this as a problem, and they're searching for ways to improve everything about their training and their operations, including the talent pool that comes in. I think we'll maintain an edge there for a long time to come.
Yeah, I would add that I think people here are certainly our comparative advantage. And this gets back to something that I think, I can't remember who said at the end of the first session of this hearing, which is the potential, what we call the uncertainty about China's ability to operate some of these capabilities. Nearly all of the things that we have been talking about in the context of China's Navy involve technology, involve technologies. With people as our comparative advantage, that gives us an operational edge that it is difficult to quantify at times. And in some ways, that's why if they fix their submarine pipeline and can get more talented people in, that might chip away in some ways at undersea superiority even more than specific technologies over time. Because I think Admiral Studeman is absolutely right that we have an edge in this space.
Thank you.
Building off of Commissioner Shmulgonian's question earlier, just want to say thank you for highlighting the administration's efforts to prioritize U.S. shipbuilding industry, U.S. merchant fleet, to reverse years of stagnation. China, your testimony outlined China's investing to win geopolitical contestation, to increase its leverage of, I think you mentioned, economic, military, technology, commercial, and political advantage. Based off of your expertise, you talked earlier in response to another question about sort of the scope and the risk. Based off of your expertise, is the CCP willing to exercise or deploy that leverage if they achieve that dominance?
You betcha. I mean, why not? I mean, you've already seen it exerted, and you know, the theory goes that the more powerful China is, the more confident it is, the more likely that it will use more of its instruments of national power across the full breadth and depth of their capabilities. And so, look, you've seen it with their pressure tactics in the South China Sea and around Taiwan, the Senkakus, on the Indian border. You see the presence in the Arctic. You see a lot of different things with regard to their long-range deployments of surface assets and some subsurface, by the way, into the far reaches of the Pacific. And you know, the Indians are worried about them going in the Indian Ocean as well. But I do think that you're exactly right. And I wanted to elevate this conversation early on to say, if you're only looking at this in terms of like a military pattern, like it all funnels into where they are and what they're doing, you're missing the point. The point is this is about a strategic competition and comprehensive national power, how you build, generate, and then employ that power. And the Chinese are hooking themselves into the world through the Belt and Road in order to get access to the resources and the markets to then build that capability, the actual ready deployable power that we have a hard time building today. Because I've made a point in other sessions about how converting your latent power into ready power is the main thing. And the United States has taken, too much risk, and we've been too brittle in what it takes to actually convert our natural advantages into real tools of power. The Chinese have never forgotten that. They've built a lot of them, and you can, bet your bottom dollar that they're going to use them as they see fit in the future. With a strong sense, too, that it's not all about hard power or sharp power. They are very savvy and very good at the combination of soft, sharp, and hard, which means smart power.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I completely agree. This is important because there's a pervasive view sometimes that, what's the harm if China actually maintains this or gains this advantage? And so thank you for those comments. I also wanted to touch on, you mentioned earlier that CI efforts are too small. Recognizing we're here to focus on Indo-Pacific, your testimony also covers leverage and activities inside the United States. In your opinion, is CI reform something that's necessary?
I do believe it is. Most people don't understand what it is to begin with. And then, like I said, I think we need to have a new concept of what counterintelligence is. And maybe we use different words to describe the function of protecting yourself, right, against foreign predation. But we need to get on it because their predatory practices have already shifted the balance of power in their direction. So for crying out loud, let's protect our economy if economic warfare is just a way of life of today, right? Political warfare, economic warfare, cyber warfare, information warfare, it's happening today. Therefore, we need suitable instruments that exist within government and suitable public-private activities to be able to protect other parts of the American economy.
So, thank you very much.
Thanks.
The U.S. is failing at open source collection. Can you talk a little bit more about that and where we're failing specifically?
We've made strides. I don't want to knock those who are working very hard within the intelligence community and the government with attempts to be able to harness all that, with deals that have been made with commercial companies, with the onboarding of artificial intelligence. There's been an alacrity that we've seen, particularly lately. And so we're on the move in this regard, right? You have a Chief Digital Affairs Office, for example, inside the Pentagon that works on trying to mainstream these capabilities and speed up and accelerate our access to them. But, you know, we, for years, frankly, didn't value the open sources the way that we should have. The amount of knowledge in the world that is created every given day is going to be tremendous, but most of that is actually accessible in the open source environment. And so my view is that classified sources are very important, but they will need to enrich the open sources after we do the tradecraft thing of validating and getting confidence levels on all those, versus the other way around, which has been the culture of the intelligence community for too long, which is that the open sources might maybe enrich my classified deck of understanding. So I think we need a culture shift. I think it's underway. Probably not happening fast enough for my taste, but I do think that a lot of enlightened people are trying to get after it.
Dr. Horowitz.
This is one place.
go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry, no.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say this is one place in particular where I feel like the incorporation of artificial intelligence could make a big deal in helping aggregate the open source intelligence out there and fuse it with information in the classified space in a way that sort of brings together the thing that folks like Admiral Studeman have been talking about.
Thank you for that. Dr. Horowitz, we talk a lot about bottlenecks in production here in the United States, and it's often rather sobering. Can you speak to what bottlenecks you see within China's production and future in this area?
I think one of the challenges here is that the bottlenecks for China are fundamentally different because their design and fielding process for ships is fundamentally different than ours. And this is true for a broader set of military capabilities as a whole. China is willing to field capabilities that are essentially good enough. They are willing to field the 80% solution. That is not something the United States has been willing to do in the past. And so, you know, this isn't the place to sort of go through the litany of issues surrounding U.S. shipbuilding in particular, or submarine production. But one of the many issues there is the emphasis on quality. Now, that is a good thing when what you are talking about is given the comparative advantage that the U.S. has in things like Virginia-class submarines or SSBNs. But because China is willing to essentially go to market with good enough technology, they don't face bottlenecks in the same kind of way, and they're willing to iterate faster generationally because they have really embraced the notion of mass in the future of military power in a different way than the United States. And we first saw this in the context of missile production, but we are now seeing it in the context of ship production and submarine production as well.
I was hoping to elicit a more optimistic or encouraging feedback, but I appreciate your response. That's all I have.
It doesn't mean that they're, I mean, if you want something more optimistic, I will tell you.
You don't have to give it to me. It's okay.
I'll give you a slightly more optimistic thing, which is I think that the it has been very challenging for them, no matter how much technology they've stolen from us, to Admiral Studeman's point, to catch up in the highest leverage, highest quality undersea technologies. They're seeking to compensate in other areas. And it's an open question in some ways, whether that bet for them is necessarily going to pay off. Like, I am very worried about that. But I do think that if what you are talking about is who has the high end when it comes to things like quieting technology, and when it comes to the, sort of like most elite part of the workforce, like that is something that remains a comparative advantage for the United States.
Thank you. We might do a quick second round if others have questions. Admiral Studeman, we've talked mostly about the Indo-Pacific region, the Western Pacific part of that, and First Island chain. Can you give us a sense now of the ops tempo and the presence in the Indian Ocean and areas outside this Western Pacific area, including the Eastern Pacific, and how we're seeing any Chinese presence near Hawaii or maybe even West Coast, or is that, an ambition of theirs?
So one of the things you look at, if you really want to understand what precedes Chinese military operations, is where their research fleets are operating, where they may lay buoys, where they may be interested in scientific collaboration in area X, Y, or Z. And it turns out the Chinese are in many different areas, right? And so the Indian Ocean has been littered with Chinese collectors, essentially, over decades, that suggest to you that there may be some economic exploration in there, but we know that these will precede additional Chinese deployments into that particular region, which of course makes New Delhi very nervous and ought to make others nervous as well. So I would suggest that you probably take a classified briefing on exactly where the Chinese have been operating. Suffice it to say, you probably will be surprised where they've operated, but it's worth kind of covering that, I think, sub rosa.
As I was listening to both of your answers on the industrial base, I take this sort of mildly dark view that the U.S. industrial base will get there eventually, but it's probably not going to happen fast enough, and it won't deliver capability fast enough. So I sort of go to the allies and partners space and always think about, like, what countries really do we have that we're close with that we can rely on to help us scale while we sort of build out the capacity of industry. And so India, Japan, Korea, maybe the Scandinavians and the Nordics come to mind. Is that a bad way to think about it, or is that the right way to think about it, or something else?
No, I think it's the right way to think about it. I think we need to have more tubes and more firepower, and I say this because that's the way the Chinese think, right? Ultimately, as they do the correlation of military forces, it's one of many political and international factors that they might consider, as they contemplate whether or not to move against Taiwan or anything else. And so they rate us, right? They scientifically rate all of our platforms and what they can do, and platforms with bigger firepower, frankly, scare them more. And we are, when we take a look at what happens in the late 80s, we end up decommissioning our SSGNs, right? There's 154 tubes, that's 600 plus tubes, right? And the Chinese know we're decommissioning our SSGNs, and so that matters. So what is there to replace that? Now you have the Virginia class. It may take 12 VLS tubes on current blocks into 40 later on in the Block 5. It still doesn't compensate for the absence of the tubes of our SSGN. So you're going to need to think more creatively, right, about the major and the middle and the smaller size. And that's where I do think we have to work more closely with the allies. Look, we're out of balance as a military. We're invested in the high end, but over-invested in the high end. And we need to keep the high end. But we need to have the middle and the low end to come in like a pyramid. So we have more of those capabilities, a larger family of those, right, to cover down and give combatant commanders and the president more options. And so I do think that that could be a multicolored, multi-flagged sort of thing that we do as we try to build out the base of the pyramid.
That's helpful. You talked about CI reform, counterintelligence reform. I leaned into this one quite a bit when I was still working here in the Senate, and I'll tell you, it is a community that does not want to be reformed. So it's something that I think is worthwhile sort of thinking about, but I think it's a very, very hard issue to get at. There are a whole bunch of competitive services across the executive branch, and it's tough. But I do want to talk to you about foreign military exploitation. You have a recommendation in here about doing more in this space. I think it's something I would just like you to just talk about for a second, because I don't think it's something that people fully understand. There's huge opportunity in terms of acquiring their platforms, and then obviously trying to get whatever you can in terms of intellectual property out of it for countermeasures and sort of other opportunities. But as we think about the intellectual property theft that has been conducted against us, are there ways that we should think about this in a new and different way for ourselves as well?
I would like to give us some credit here. We're very smart, creative, savvy, clever collectors, and I think that will continue. We have some of the world's best professionals that are in this field. And frankly, sometimes, we've got to use friends, access through friends, to be able to get, something that would be important for us to know. It used to be that you could say, hey, I want to get access to, let's say a friend has a Kilo submarine, let me exploit the Kilo submarine. Increasingly, in today's world of foreign material acquisition and then exploitation, it's the subcomponents and it's the elements of something that matter. It's the cyber capability, right? It's the software that's inside the wiring, the hardware. And so that's where it gets really complex for us. It's really difficult because it's, like climbing Mount Everest. Of all the things that you want to have, you want to prioritize the most important, but increasingly they are critical elements of a target system, not simply how fast does it go, what's its endurance, et cetera, right? And so it's getting more and more complicated as technology becomes more sophisticated, and we need, I think, to create more support for that area, because if you can't get that right, you don't know exactly how that red system operates. Therefore, you may underrate it, and it could lead to the loss of American lives later on, right? We need to create counters and mitigators. We need to understand systems thoroughly to accurately characterize the danger that exists for us. And it's not just about the individual things, of course, it's about all the networks that connect these things together. So what is the algorithmic solution for them as they develop a way to interconnect all these capabilities?
Thank you. Hopefully my magnanimous chair will let me ask another question just before we wrap up. You talked about open source, and one of the things that was always striking to me when I left my last position was how much was actually available in the open source space. Thing one. Thing two, this is an issue that we've been trying to get after since 9/11. After 9/11, I've heard no sort of new ideas or sort of novel approaches here. Everybody says, oh, we should fuse the things that are on the high side with the low side. I mean, go tell a CIA analyst that and it won't ever happen, but they'd love to do it. Do you have any new ideas in this space that haven't been tried? I'd really sort of welcome your views there. And then I'll do this just so Commissioner Shriver doesn't get mad at me. Mr. Horowitz, you've done a lot of work historically on autonomous systems. You didn't really talk about it here, but I mean, this feels like one of these things that's just not ready for prime time. At least that's what we heard from Admiral Seif. How should we think about this? Because this is, we're seeing in Ukraine every day that this is the future. So how do we get there, and how do you think about it today?
So I'll start with that first question, and I appreciate it because I do think that if government intends to do it all, government will fail, right? We have so many restrictions that have grown over the decades on what we can do with information that we don't know how to actually shed these rules. We've minimized ourselves into spaces that have prevented us from doing things at speed and with deep insight. And so I think we're going to need to depend more on commercial companies that, guess what, have a great deal of skill in acquiring massive amounts of information and deriving knowledge and insight. So the beauty of the future, in my view, is not to try to make government do anything. You can improve beyond where they are for sure, and some things are happening. But the real music, to me, the real symphonic effects you're going to get, the better knowledge you're going to acquire faster for the protective or the option effects that you need, come with trusting other companies to be in partnership with the U.S. government to provide what only they can provide, right? Because they may be better at actually anonymizing, metadata, so they never have to worry about getting a, U.S. name or, any U.S. information involved there. They figured it out, right, in many places. And so I think that's where we need to be more serious about what does our partnership look like with which companies that can actually, do this already today. Thanks.
That's a great question. I would add that, in the context of what I think we need for the future of the Navy, which is a high-low mix between our high-end, more exquisite capabilities and more what I've called precise mass, there's a real opportunity here, frankly, in combination with allies and partners, to get back to your earlier question, in using yacht yards as the basis to sort of build and field more of those low-end capabilities. Think collaborative combat aircraft, but for the surface Navy, which gives you more shooters as well, in combination with increasingly autonomous systems. And communication is an issue undersea. That's in some ways the issue with having something like an autonomous weapon system undersea. But you could imagine more simple variants that are pre and placed, sort of slightly fancier than what you would imagine a naval mine as, that you could pre-position and then activate in the context of a crisis situation or at the outset of a conflict. So I think there are a lot of potential opportunities for autonomy in the undersea, precisely because it's this arena where communication is more difficult. So having effectively operated autonomous systems would be incredibly useful.
That was great. Thanks, Mike.